Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast episode. Today I talked to Naël. He has been in the crypto space since 2014, and we will talk about the early days of crypto, about peer-to-peer networks, about the philosophy behind the Web3, but also how it is changing and a lot of other things. So stay tuned.
Make a probability of what would remain in the future. And for that, the way I approach it is to look at it as a spectrum. On the one end, we've got the pure peer-to-peers, the anarchists, the total liberators. And on the other, you've got the pure regulators, the CDBCs and the permissioned ledgers. And I think that we will end up with something in between.
Welcome on today's podcast episode, Naël. He's in the crypto space since 2014, and today we will talk about DeFi, especially asset tokenization. Welcome to my podcast, Naël.
Hi, Sebastian. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
So my first question is always, who are you and what do you do?
So my background is computer science and design. I studied mostly in Switzerland, computer science and design. And like you said, I've been in crypto since 2014, and I've been in it ever since. I am currently leading an investment fund that's focusing on tokenized equity. It's called Two Kings Capital. And we're looking to launch pretty soon, and that's pretty much my background. Yeah.
This sounds great. And also, since you're very early into the space, my question is, of course, was there a specific moment when you fell into the rabbit hole?
Yeah, absolutely. Pretty quickly, actually. I was always growing up. I tended to try and find a way to design my career in an unorthodox fashion. I was looking always to do the opposite of what most people did, and I thought the world was going towards technology. It's always a basis on which to build new modes of living, and particularly in computer science, I was interested in distributed systems and specifically peer-to-peer technologies, since I always believed the way to be free and to live as independently as possible required the least amount of dependencies, and living in a sovereign fashion where you can be your own everything and cut out intermediaries was the way to go. And when I discovered Bitcoin and specifically the blockchain, I was totally drawn to it as soon as I understood its implications for society.
Yeah, definitely. It's really an interesting concept. Later, we will probably also discuss like the pros and cons of no intermediaries and, let's say, a very unregulated ecosystem. But before, I wanted to talk a little bit about the early days of crypto. So have you been to some of the conferences also in 2014 or the following, like the early years?
The early years, there weren't much conferences. There were more meetups that were organized on a sovereign basis. Having studied in Switzerland during the early days, and Switzerland being an important financial hub, people in fintech quickly caught on to the idea of decentralized ledgers. And I attended a couple of conferences. I was doing an internship at Pictet Bank, one of the leading private wealth managers, and not far from them was developing the Geneva Bitcoin Hub, where some of the guys ended up working on the Cosmos SDK. They're now currently formalizing the standards for crypto securities that are legally binding in Switzerland. but everyone understood that there was important implications for this technology. But I think at the time we didn't realize that the amount of wealth migration would happen so quickly.
Yeah. And would you say the people changed? Because when I look like at pictures or videos like from the early days, I think it's much more, let's say you have a lot of programmers or at least stereotypes of programmers. And when you look at today's like Bitcoin Miami conference or something, it looks like you have like a lot of people who would basically go to a nightclub.
Absolutely. There's still that very strong dichotomy between the the true pioneers that are in love with building liberating technologies that fall in the class of the ideals such as the book The Sovereign Individual, which, as far as I can see, Peter Thiel, who's the first investor in Ethereum, wrote the renewed preface. And so you have this core anarchist community that wants to disintermediate the world and bring humans to a type of social order where we can live interdependently. And obviously, at the other extreme, you have what we could call the masses that catch on to the hype, hear about the potential to make quick money quickly, and would rather be on that side of the playing field.
Definitely. I think it's very interesting that a lot of, I would say, the early developers have a more or less anarchistic worldview. And also very interesting to see some of the projects also of Peter Thiel or what he says, and some of the communities which built there. I think there was also like a city on the sea which wanted to be in the future like completely independent. And I think often these movements are quite connected to the crypto scene.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love that. Like the early days were for me. I think a lot of us, especially at the university, didn't understand the implications of Ethereum. Um, my introduction to Bitcoin was ironically enough when a friend of mine, his father, he was working at the United Nations, received a decommissioned server, and he gave me the server, which comes from the United Nations, the sovereign bloc, the government, the main intermediary of society. And I received the server and I used it to mine Bitcoin early in the day, but it was really clunky, difficult to get up and running. It wasn't very profitable, but those were the early days. Similarly for Ethereum, understanding that there was now the possibility to run Turing complete apps on a distributed ledger was not as clear as it is now, and so making the decision to buy ETH at the pre-ICO for 80 cents, it didn't. Very few people actually did it. I think it was too early to tell that was going to turn out the way it is. Yeah.
Definitely. I think even if you have like a great technology, there are so many different factors also being relevant for the further success of, let's say, a cryptocurrency or any crypto project or even like a startup. Because if you have read the book The Cryptopians from Laura Shin, she tells about all the up and downs of Ethereum. And there were like several moments in the history of Ethereum where the whole project could have failed. And also like the fork, right after the hack of the DAO, it could also have meant the end of the Ethereum blockchain. And I think looking at a lot of the ICOs or at the NFT projects we're having seen, especially in the summer of last year, I think it's hard to predict which project will be successful in the long term, because I was looking at a lot of projects, and also not only at the art, but what they want to do with it and how the long-term execution will look like. And some were very promising, with also founders with an Ivy League background, fully doxed. And I talked to them like in a video chat, and I thought, okay, this project is very promising, and then they just went away. So it's I think it's hard to predict.
It's very difficult to predict. I think as human beings, we don't understand how bad we are at predicting. As That's what Nassim Taleb says in his book, The Black Swan.
Yeah.
We should not try predict because we're terrible at it. I think you're right in that regard. But nevertheless, we can try and funnel down the probability.
Yeah.
We can make a probability of what would remain in the future. And for that, the way I approach it is to look at it as a spectrum. On the one end, we've got the pure peer-to-peers, the anarchists, the total liberators. And then the other, you've got the pure regulators, the CDBCs and the permissioned ledgers. And I think that we will end up with something in between. Like Hegel, the philosopher, said, you first have a thesis and then an antithesis, but what remains is the synthesis. For me, crypto is the thesis. Regulated technology, permission blockchains are the antithesis, which is what we're experiencing now with the crackdown on Tornado Cash and the likes. And what I think will remain will be something in between, synthesis, a merging of semi-permissioned, decentralized ledgers.
Yeah. Talking about Tornado Cash, what's your opinion on the current situation?
I haven't looked in it too much because I did not use that service.
Yeah.
So it doesn't concern me directly. I find it abominable that a developer could have been arrested on terms that he built a protocol that financed terrorism or masqueraded funds that bypass Russian sanctions. It just goes to show that what's really changing the world now is being able to write code. But I think such systems will take a new form, and they will continue to push the boundaries of those in power.
Yeah, I think it's a hard decision, or also from a philosophical perspective, because I think I saw like a video of Coffee Zilla about the crackdown of Tornado Cash, and if I'm not wrong, I think 30% of let's say the use cases were related to criminal activities, and 70% of the use cases were related to, let's say, not criminal activities. And I'm always not sure. So even if you look at Monero, for example, I also had like a discussion with friends of mine which have invested in Monero. And I personally said, okay, I don't want to invest in Monero because I think it is primarily used by criminal activities. I don't have a statistic for that, but it is like the same thing why I don't want to invest in like tobacco companies, because I don't want to support it. On the other hand, it is a little bit like the deep web, right? Of course, you have like criminal activities in the dark web, but you also have a lot of journalists doing their work there, and a lot of people in regimes where they can communicate openly, connecting there. So I'm always a little bit torn between the two sides. But to be totally honest, I think looking at a lot of these mixers and the criminal activities related to them, I would say I'm more on the side of the regulators, probably.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay.
but but also
it
not. Yeah,
it's a very difficult case to be made because it's it's uh, it's a type of dystopian scenario where the technology is being used for two extremes,
hmm,
and the people that are using it for extremes that are in their own interests,
yeah.
where there it might be collateral damage, but the collateral damage is difficult to quantify, and that is the metric that should be evaluated to penalize the wrong using of the protocol.
It reminds me also about the discussion about the online platforms, for example, like Twitter or Facebook, Instagram. Should they be reliable for the content on their platforms? And I think it's a hard decision to make because should like a private company have the power to decide who's on their platform and who is not. And of course, I think in some cases it's they should definitely have the decision when we are talking about child pornography and these cases. Where I think it becomes very difficult is also talking about Donald Trump. So I'm not a fan of him, but if you have or money is like the indicator that you can decide if he's on Twitter or not, I think uh, it's insane because Elon Musk, for example, he can decide with $44 billion if he wants like the president or the ex-president of the United States of America on the platform or not. And should like an individual, like for example Elon Musk in this case, as a single person, as an individual, have the decision or have the possibility to decide who's on Twitter or not.
Yeah, it's true. Money is an a materialistic but abstract representation of power. And luckily, we're moving into a system where anyone can mint their own money and amass a community and use that money to represent the power to vote on
Mhm.
where capital should be allocated to build what infrastructures that contribute to the designing of society and the types of lifestyles that we can live, that we can have. Um, so it kind of goes both ways. Luckily, we have distributed ledgers, and let's hope that they continue to fall in the right hands, and that people are educated about the way it's decentralizing power.
This also leads like to the next big topic of the interview, and it is like, is crypto becoming mainstream and will the ecosystem be different than our traditional financial system? And I want to, of course, start with the popular quote of Jack Dorsey, who wrote on Twitter, "You don't own Web3, the VCs and their LPs do. It will never escape their incentives. It's ultimately a centralized entity with a different label." And for those who do not know what a VC is, it's short for venture capital, and LP is for limited partners. And of course, I want to know your opinion on this quote.
I partly believe what Jack Dorsey says, mainly because I think from his perspective, he's seen so much and done so much that you'd be likely to be persuaded by what he says.
Mhm.
I think it's partly true because there seems to have come now a critical moment where the technology is being, in my eyes, hijacked.
Yeah.
What attracted me to crypto was the idea of the sovereign individual, that I didn't have to follow the canonical path through life of going through the rigid structure of a corporation to get a salary, pay out a pension, and then follow that yellow brick road, but instead build my own life by having all my time free to build my own wealth along tools of collaboration and decentralized ledgers. Um, I think Jack Dorsey's not far off from the truth, and I can
Mhm.
understand why his efforts of building the ironic Web 5 uh,
Yeah.
and staying true to peer-to-peer technologies is such an important thing. I think the other team that's working really closely to maintain these core principles is the Tether the Tether team with their efforts of building Keet.io and their synonym um, web stack. Um, and they've understood that the next layer is identity, decentralized identity,
Yeah.
because as a citizen, the institution, which is the government, the nation, that defines your right to identity, and then for you to use identity to have access to resources and institutions. If you can decentralize this issuing of identity, then you've got the second layer for peer-to-peer technology. Um,
I
so
just
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I just recorded last week an episode on soulbound tokens. And for those now in the future who have not listened to it, just listen to it, that you have the background on soulbound tokens, what they are. And I think this is like soulbound tokens or decentralized identities is very interesting. But there, in my opinion, there are also still a lot of problems. Because I think in order to get like the decentralized identity or soulbound tokens, you should have like a centralized entity. And now the question is, who would I rather trust? Would I rather trust like a state, or would I rather trust like a private corporation? And to be honest, I would personally, living in Germany, probably trust more the German state than like a organization which is sitting in a offshore, probably in an offshore
Mhm.
environment and giving out these decentralized identities. But on the other hand, if I would have like a weaker state, I would say it's like, of course, maybe not the right term, but let's say like a state which is conflicted maybe by corruption or other things. I would probably, if you have like a corporation, like for example Apple, or some corporation which is quite focused on privacy, um, there might be the case that I would trust the corporation more than the state. And the other big problem was like also from a um, computational or programming perspective, if you lose like your decentralized identity or if you get hacked, how will you recover it? And there are of course some mechanisms where you have like communities, and the community or can help you to recover your decentralized identity. But then the question will be, what will be there first? Will be there first the recovery mechanism or the decentralized identity?
Yeah, it's certainly a very difficult problem to crack because it's sort of like a chicken and egg problem.
Hmm.
The source of defining a certificate which identifies you, whether it comes from a government or a corporation, is still a centralized issuer. You know, uh, to create a truly decentralized identity, we need to find ways to step outside completely, where the certifiers are distributed in themselves.
Hmm.
Like I don't know, for example, you make a list of 100 of the people you know the best, and you get them to vote on you declaring that you are who you say you are. So let's take the example of like an immigrant who's had to leave his war-torn country. His government is in complete collapse. He has no institution. The government cannot issue him an identity. So he arrives as an immigrant in the European Union, and he says to the European Union that he comes from such and such country. But if there was a way for him to collect the signatures of his 10 closest friends who are peers in a network who can certify his identity, that might be, a solution as opposed to just pushing around the issuer of identity.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And can you maybe explain a little bit more what Tether is doing? Because I'm not involved in this project, or I haven't
So
read much about it.
Tether has been a controversial project for a long time. I have a feeling that Tether is sort of the project that faked it until they made it. I remember
Mm-hmm.
the very early days. I was in crypto before Tether came to be. They decided to. They were one of the first projects to use to mint a token against Bitcoin by using the Omni protocol. So they would burn Bitcoin to represent their own types of tokens, which were
Mm-hmm.
tethered to Bitcoin, and you had to create this really complicated oh, um, auth to log in to have access to your wallet and so on and so forth. Um, and they had a series of offshore accounts to represent their model of a stable coin, which is backed 1-to-1 with the US dollar. And they've been through a whole lot of controversial audits that are only finally somewhat now becoming resolved. Um, but I mean, I I know I don't really know anyone working directly in the project, but it looks like their efforts are honest, and they've been the most robust stablecoin to date. Um, and their push for decentralized peer-to-peer technologies above Tether itself, so this the synonym stack, is something to pay attention to. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm still quite conflicted about Tether. So with everything happened in the past, and also I think they took the part away where where they say like every Tether is backed one by one by I don't know $1 or real assets. Um, I'm not so sure. And also with like Hindenburg Research, the famous short seller, giving away like a 1 million bounty on how Tether is backed, and like Terra Luna in the past. Of course, I can't deny that the project is quite stable in the past, but I cannot explain myself how like a company or an institution or however you want to call them with 70 billion in assets uh, can be flying so much under the radar. I mean, they must leave traces, right? If they have the money invested, and yeah, so
mhm.
I'm not too sure about
Yeah,
it.
it's quite a controversial. I had a lot of suspicion for a very long time. I actually would notice a tendency that as soon as Tether would inject new tokens, then the Bitcoin
Mhm.
price would pump. And there was a similar correlation with the recent Bitcoin, besides the Tether collapse, sorry, the Luna UST collapse.
Mhm.
There was a step down of Tether tokens, and there was a similar relationship between that removal of capital and the Bitcoin price lowering. So it looks like there's some sort of artificial mechanism keeping the two together. Um, but it's hard to say for sure. There are a lot of hedge funds betting short against
Mhm.
Tether still. Um, and but man, we could dive really deeply into conspiracy theories. You know that
Totally.
Tether is backed by Chinese commercial paper, 30%, and that Bitcoin is a Chinese financial weapon to bring down the Western financial system. I mean, there are many theories flying around, but I think it's very hard to say for sure.
Yeah, the thing I think is, as you told, there's no real incentive for a lot of the stakeholders to, let's say, to uncover that for the case Tether is not legit, to uncover it. It's a little bit like art forgery. Reminds me of the case of Wolfgang Beltracchi, who's like a famous art forger from Germany, and everybody in the system like where he forged his art was not interested that it will be known that he forged like an old master, because for example he get the testation from an art expert, and the expert of course has a reputation and he takes a lot of money um, to look at certain artworks and say, okay, this is like, for example, a real Campendong, or this is a real Picasso or something like that. And then in the next step, there are, for example, the auction houses like Sotheby's, Christie's, and stuff. And they, of course, also have like a reputation. They don't want that their reputation is damaged too. And in the last point, there's the buyer. Of course, if you're the buyer and you buy like a forged Picasso, and it will be known, the price of your artwork will probably drop. And now, bridging the gap to the crypto ecosystem, I think, of course, Tether is used a lot, and also to funnel funds into the whole ecosystem, and used by a lot of exchanges. And exchanges, or crypto exchanges, have like a very special position in the whole DeFi ecosystem, because they are basically the entrance point between DeFi and the real world. And why should they have like a real incentive that it will be known that like Tether is not backed one-to-one, or there are some other flaws about Tether?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tether is remaining. It's controversy. I follow some what I think are key people in cryptocurrencies on Twitter, and they seem to make the correlation, the case that Bitcoin could potentially drop to between 10 and 15K because of a depegging of Tether to the US dollar. Now, I don't know whether that's likely. I think on the other side, I've heard other people that I respect greatly who have said that the Tether case has been debunked, and they do represent in reserves the funds that they say they have, and that so far this model for a stablecoin is proving to be the most useful inside of DeFi and on-ramp, off-ramp channels. And that beyond this, decentralized stablecoin still has to prove itself to be worthy for a more decentralized crypto ecosystem.
Yeah, let's see where the way goes. It's of course very interesting, and of course coming back to the question about will the ecosystem be different than our traditional financial system. I am thinking about a lot of things. One of them is also that you have a lot of people coming from the traditional financial system into the decentralized financial system, because they want to have them as experts, and they of course are often very smart, and they see the possibilities in the space. And what I also thought about is, you have some institutions, right? They build like a reputation, or they build like some influence in the DeFi space, and then I would say they don't behave so much different than traditional financial institutions. How do you see it?
What I'm seeing from my perspective is that traditional finance is still where the majority of wealth is locked up. It's still very liquid. The intermediaries are still very strong, but there is clearly an effort towards moving from accounts-based bookkeeping towards token-based bookkeeping. And that means first building the infrastructure for custodial services, and then building out decentralized ledgers. Now, the major effort that I see right now are stock exchanges, traditional stock exchanges that have something like 20 times the market cap of cryptocurrencies right now in terms of wealth. They're busy building digital asset exchanges. Here in Switzerland. There's a bit of hype around, the Swiss stock exchange building SDX in Singapore. It's likewise Luxembourg, the UK, and the first pillar is custody, to be able to hold the custody of crypto securities and cryptocurrencies. Um, the other factor is the building out of financial market infrastructures, registries, decentralized registries. Which institutions will have the rights to be centralized security depositories? And I think all of this is being held together by the definition of what a security is in
Hmm.
in inside of cryptocurrencies, and that's still not very clear worldwide. I think Switzerland is the most advanced right now. They
Yeah,
have amended parts of the financial acts since about a year ago, where where certain tokenized shares are actually lawfully bound securities, and that's opened up a whole new marketplace in Switzerland for private tokenized equity. And that's what I'm looking at right now, because I think, to answer your question, the future of securities and crypto securities is going to go along in this direction. Something regulated, where where businesses can have access to new forms of capital through tokenization.
definitely. And I also talked to Lukas Pfeiffer, who has like a strong background in the crypto mining industry. And he said with the lockdown of mining or the shutdown of mining in China, a lot of the miners were moving to the US. And by moving to the US, a huge push for regulation has come, also like for insurance for the miners and all the stuff. And I say this because a few days ago, at the moment where we are recording, the message came out that Coinbase will be partnering up with blockchain, with BlackRock. And I think with a lot of these huge institutional investors coming into the ecosystem, regulation will definitely follow because they need regulation in order for to maintain the business model.
Yeah, absolutely. Compliance is a big word which more traditional players and controllers of capital have played by for a very, very long time. And what we're trying to do is, like Mark Rich, the famous commodity trader, said, is walk along the knife's edge to build and use tools that are in between what is permitted, what is not recommended, but what's not allowed. And I think that's where opportunity lies right now. And that takes the form of minor changes in regulation, which allow new types of behavior,
Mhm.
um, and which open up access to important opportunity.
Yeah, to blue ocean markets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always looking to invest in such opportunities. It's like also in Germany, you have this big case, or you had this big case a few years ago with long distance bus traveling. And there was a completely new market opening up. And some people, of course, used it and built like Flixbus, one of the largest large mile distance bus bus companies, and I think it's crazy. And also, besides like the crypto ecosystem, what I think is very interesting in the DACH region or the German market is online pharmacies. I made like a bad bet at the end of last year where I had like a lot of options on online pharmacies. Because there will be probably a shift in regulation. But I don't want to go too deep on this topic. And also to all listeners, there's no financial advice. Please do your own research. I lost some money with my options, but I'm always looking for blue ocean markets. And as you said, asset tokenization can be extremely interesting because, of course, it makes a lot of assets. Like I read a paper from EY and they classified it in three categories, like tokenization, like physical objects, financial and financial products as the first category. the second, payment options, and the third, intangible assets. Everything can be investable. And also, if you look like patents or licenses or all this stuff, also like songs where you have royalties and only private equity could invest there. And recent times, it will probably become investable also, let's say, for end consumers, and would democratize the financial markets more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is over the next 10 years, sort of what we can expect. The Internet of Value, the tokenization of the many things which we value. And that's what I'm looking at right now. In the crypto space, I look at this is not financial advice or whatever, but it's an investment thesis for looking at new types of techniques which change the constraints and the boundaries with which we're able to do things. So one major pillar is peer-to-peer. That's really an incredible layer to look at in pure crypto. And that's the other spectrum of sort of anarchist. Then you've got the inside of RegTech, the emergence of tokenized business functions. If we consider a business to be at its core a nexus of contracts, just a cluster of contracts between different counterparties, shareholders, customers, suppliers, and we can create smart contracts that replicate and automate those functions entirely, and that they are regulated under sovereign law. We could create entire forms of automated business models that live on distributed ledgers. And I think we're in the early days of this, of businesses that are just beginning to tokenize the first thing, which is their equity, but later it'll move towards entire businesses being tokenized, being completely automated. And that's really interesting right now. Here in Switzerland is sort of the first of its kind that I've seen that's allowing you to invest in tokenized equity.
Yeah, I also use, I think I already told you, I use personally timeless investments to invest like in fractional shares of a Banksy or of a old timer, sneakers, art, and other physical objects. I think there are still some open questions. And one question which I think is not asked enough in the crypto space is, do you really need a blockchain? And I think sometimes yes, because if you want to have, for example, these Banksy shares traded on several platforms, but if you have like one big centralized institution, or let's say one large exchange, which would fractionalize everything, and in this case it would be like timeless investments, and you can trade on their platform. The question is, if everybody would be on the platform, is there the necessity to have a blockchain? And of course, this is like a small company, but if you take, for example, Apple, and Apple would do the same thing, or like one of these gigantic companies, like for Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, or something, I think, there's still the open question.
Yeah, there's still the open question. I think blockchains are very specific use cases. They're most useful where trust is not clear. 'Cause at the end of the day, they're just trust machines, automated trust machines. So perhaps in times of war and in times of great authoritarianism, or where the system has reached its limit. I really like the economics of Hayek, and I think a lot of his work has to do with a lot of blockchain technology and this type of structure we're building for the world comes out of these principles of spontaneous order, of moving the transaction from the institution to the network. I think that we've reached the limits of capitalism that tries to distribute the world's resources from a source through intermediaries towards a structure that's decentralized, like an ant colony, or where the nodes are distributed. Yeah,
Now, this also leads to the question if the network is really fully decentralized. Because if I look, for example, at the Ethereum network, I would say the Ethereum Foundation has quite a considerable influence and also some certain stakeholders. So um, I think there are still some open questions, and one of the largest open question I'm always thinking about. It also came from an interview. It was with Dr. Eisenhofer. He's like the CEO of Financial.com, and he said, "Yeah, the U.S. is having this large army with basically two very friendly neighbors, right? And they have like a strong incentive that the US dollar stays the leading currency in the world. There's also like a strong correlation between like the peak influence um, of a country or of an empire, for example, the British Empire, and how strong the currency is. And I would say the influence of a country correlates with how strongly the currency is used. And now, if you take, for example, all the spending of the US on the military, or it can be also, of course, another country, but it has to be like a rich country. And let's take a country like the US or China or Germany, and they say they want to influence this crypto network. They could, for example, buy enough computer capacity to change the network as they want, right?
absolutely. Yeah, the question of decentralization is difficult to formalize. At the end of the day, all systems tend to centralize themselves. If you look at the merge to proof of stake, I mean that there's something like 4 or 5 main protocols or institutions that have the majority of ETH locked up for the merge. Um, I think a very prominent intellectual that I follow is Balaji. He has quite a complicated surname, Sarajinovin, and he recently wrote an interesting book thesis called The Network State. I highly recommend watching his YouTube video about it. He's got a very interesting thesis of how we could be moving away from nations entirely towards distributed networks. Your last point on how a country could jeopardize a blockchain is actually quite trivial, because at the end of the day, a blockchain like Bitcoin is rooted by electricity. And if a country or a government has a mapping of exactly where the energy is being pulled out of the earth and can apply, let's say, CO2 quotas on the companies that are using this energy, that's a perfect control on the price already, or on the amount of the time it takes to mine a block, or to adjust the hash, the difficulty of 2 weeks on the Bitcoin blockchain, for example.
Yeah. So I'm very interested how everything will develop. And I think a question always has to be asked regarding the tokenization of assets is, do we really want to be everything to become tradable? And of course, there are benefits, but I think you should also think about the cons. For example, if you take real estate, I would say, I don't know if it's good if real estate is fractionalized and to become tradable, because when you have real estate, I think you should have a certain responsibility to the people living in the building. And I think the responsibility, even right now, has not always been taken care of. And when you have like tokenized real estate, and it becomes so much tradable, I think it's easy to lose the connection to the real asset and to just see it as a security and not as an asset or not as an object where real people live in.
Absolutely. The major problem with distributed ledgers that track the value of real world objects is this on-world, off-world separation. It's a very difficult problem to crack. A project like Centrifuge on Polkadot is trying to map, NFTs to that, but those type of business models fall prey to I think what's called in geography the tragedy of the commons. You take, for example, a nature reserve of land. It belongs to everyone, but no one. And so no one will take the responsibility of taking care of it. So everyone throws their rubbish there. Whereas if you have a very rich individual like Richard Branson, he decides he's going to buy everything. He does it and he takes really good care of that piece of land, that piece of nature. But then you've got the far left saying, "Oh no, you cannot privatize this land. It should belong to everyone." And I think you could experience the same problem with a very big building that belongs to everyone, but in fractional parts. It's difficult to associate responsibility in such a situation. Yeah.
Totally. I'm very interested where everything will go and how the ecosystem is developing. But I would say for now, Naël, I thank you very much for the interview, and hopefully in let's say a year or something, you come back to my show and we make an update on your investments and also how the tokenization of private equity has developed.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sebastian, for having me on your show, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast episode. As always, I'm happy for your feedback, and if you have not joined our Discord channel yet, check the link in the description. Moreover, the Crypto Assets Conference will take place in October 18th and October 19th, and I got the possibility to give you free tickets. So more information is on the Discord channel in the channel announcement. I hope to see you in the next episode, and maybe if you're also in person on the conference, I will be there. I will try to report on the topics we can meet. So let me know. So cheers and have a great day.